Summer 1943 baked the earth into a hard crust, and the road to the small Texas town shimmered as though it were made of glass. Dust swirled around the convoy of olive-drab trucks groaning toward the horizon, each one crammed with captured men in field-gray uniforms. The locals had been warned to stay calm, but the town still gathered on porches and storefront steps, curious as barn cats. They watched the spectacle in silence, as though a circus had rolled through, only this circus carried the men who had tried to burn the world. Inside one of the trucks sat Oberleutnant Franz Keller, his uniform still crisp despite days of travel. His boots were polished, his chin unshaven but proud. He held himself straight, refusing to let his back touch the hot metal siding of the truck. Across from him, Otto Meissner shifted nervously, wiping sweat from his neck with his cap. "I thought Texas would be full of cowboys," Otto muttered, peering out through the slats. "Where are the horses?" Franz's mouth twitched. "Perhaps they traded them for these trucks," he said. His voice was dry, cultured, and calm, though his mind was far from it. This was not how he had imagined captivity. Propaganda had promised he'd be shipped to England, starved, interrogated, beaten. Instead, here he was, alive, rolling through a town that looked as though war had never touched it. On the roadside, children waved small American flags, their faces shining with innocent curiosity. Some of the men looked away, ashamed. Others stared defiantly, eyes hard as steel. One farmer spat into the dust and muttered something under his breath. The heat was so thick it clung to every breath, making the world seem slow and dreamlike. When the trucks ground to a halt, Sergeant Harold Whitaker climbed down from the lead vehicle and barked an order. He was tall and broad-shouldered, his sunburned skin and drawl giving him the air of a man who had been raised under the same sky his whole life. His rifle was slung casually, but his eyes were sharp, watchful. "All right, Krauts," he called. "Out you get. Single file, keep your hands where I can see 'em. Nobody does anything stupid, and nobody gets hurt." The prisoners obeyed. Boots hit the dirt one by one, raising little puffs of powdery soil. Franz landed lightly, straightening to his full height, taking in his surroundings with a soldier's eye. The camp was not far, a set of barracks surrounded by barbed wire, watchtowers at each corner. It looked new, almost freshly built, as though America had been waiting for them. Otto leaned toward Franz. "They built all this just for us?" "It would seem so," Franz said, though he wasn't sure whether to be impressed or unnerved. As they marched toward the gate, Franz felt the weight of hundreds of American eyes. Women in calico dresses, shopkeepers with suspenders over white shirts, even a preacher stood with his hat in hand as though blessing or judging them. Franz couldn't tell which. The whole town seemed to have come out just to witness their arrival, as though seeing the enemy up close would make the war feel real. Inside the camp, Lieutenant James Wilcox waited. He was a clean-shaven man in his mid-30s, his uniform immaculate despite the heat. His face was unreadable, carved into the professional mask of a man who had seen enough trouble not to show it. He nodded curtly at Harold, then turned to the prisoners. "Welcome to Camp Huntsville," Wilcox said, his voice carrying over the dusty yard. "You will be treated according to the Geneva Convention. You will work, you will eat, you will sleep. You will not attempt escape. You will not cause trouble. Do this, and you will be fine." The words were simple, but they landed heavily. Some of the men looked visibly relieved. Otto let out a low whistle. "Geneva Convention," he whispered to Franz. "I thought that was just something the officers talked about." Franz ignored him, studying Wilcox's face. The American was not gloating. If anything, he seemed tired, businesslike. That unsettled Franz more than open hostility would have. After roll call, they were led to the mess hall. The smell hit them first: rich beef stew, fresh bread, and the faint sweetness of coffee. Men glanced at one another, uneasy. This was not the thin cabbage soup of Africa, not the hard black bread of the front. This was a meal. When they were served, Otto dug in like a starving man. Franz, slower, lifted his spoon and let the first bite linger on his tongue. It tasted of fat and pepper and something else, something dangerously close to kindness. "You think this is a trick?" Otto asked, his mouth full. "Perhaps," Franz said. "Perhaps they mean to fatten us before the slaughter." But even as he said it, he knew it wasn't true. That night, they were issued clean blankets and cigarettes. Some men wept quietly under the thin light bulbs strung along the barracks. Franz lay awake, staring at the ceiling. Outside, crickets chirped, and somewhere far off a train whistle cut through the night. It sounded lonely, like a song from another world. He thought of his last day in Africa, the burning sun, the chaos of surrender, the long voyage across the Atlantic. Everything had felt like defeat. And yet here, lying on a clean cot with a full stomach, he felt something more complicated, more dangerous. He felt safe. Otto turned over in the bunk below. "Franz," he whispered, "if this is what losing looks like, I wonder what winning is." Franz did not answer. He closed his eyes and listened to the camp settle into sleep. Somewhere near the gate, a guard laughed at something one of his comrades said, the sound light and unguarded. It was a sound Franz had not heard in years, not since before the war began. When morning came, they were marched to the edge of a wide, golden field. A farmer stood waiting, his hat tipped back on his head, his hands on his hips. Harold handed out tools, hoes, rakes, gloves, and gestured for the men to begin. Franz took up a hoe and felt the strange weight of it, heavier than his Mauser had ever been. The earth was warm beneath his boots, the air buzzing with heat and cicadas. He looked out at the endless rows of crops and felt the first flicker of realization. America had no shortage of anything. Not land, not food, not machines. When the whistle blew for a break, he wiped the sweat from his brow and saw the farmer smiling faintly at them, as if amused that these soldiers, these proud sons of the Reich, were now just laborers under a Texas sky. Franz gripped the hoe and looked back at the camp, at the watchtower gleaming in the distance. The war felt far away now, as though he had stepped into another world entirely. For the first time, a thought came unbidden and would not leave. Perhaps we never stood a chance. And as the day wore on, as the sun climbed higher and the field shimmered in the heat, he wondered what other truths this strange, generous enemy might yet reveal. The sun rose like a brass shield over the Texas plains, flooding the world in gold. By the time the prisoners marched out, the air already hummed with heat. The field seemed to stretch forever, the wheat rippling like an ocean, each stalk catching the light as though the land itself were alive. Franz Keller walked at the head of the line, boots crunching against the dirt road, his face unreadable. Behind him, Otto Meissner whistled softly until Harold Whitaker shot him a look sharp enough to cut the sound off mid-note. The work was endless, but not cruel. They were handed gloves, given water breaks, even shaded spots under a tree when the sun reached its highest point. The farmer, Mr. Dempsey, they had learned, stood at the edge of the field, nodding with quiet approval as he watched them work. He was older, his hair gone silver, but his shoulders still broad, and he carried himself like a man who had seen hard seasons and outlasted them. "You boys keep this up," he said to Harold. "I might have the best harvest I've had in years." "That's the idea," Harold replied. "Army don't want nothin' going to waste. Even a war doesn't stop a wheat field from growing." Franz overheard the exchange, his brow furrowing. A war didn't stop the wheat from growing. That thought stuck with him as he bent to his task. Every pull of the hoe felt like a reminder that this country, vast and unbroken, kept feeding itself while sending armies across the ocean. He pictured Berlin in his mind, streets pocked with craters, ration cards for bread, air raid sirens howling through the night. Here, the silence was so complete it almost mocked him. Otto, sweating and red-faced, worked next to him. "I didn't know there was this much food in the whole world," he said between breaths. Franz glanced at him. "Then you have not been paying attention." "What do you mean?" "I mean that this is why we will lose," Franz said, his voice low. "Look around you. They have enough land to feed every man, woman, and soldier they have, and us too." Otto didn't answer. He just kept swinging the hoe, his expression troubled. At noon, the prisoners were called to rest. They sat under the wide shadow of a pecan tree, the smell of earth and cut grain clinging to their clothes. Mr. Dempsey's wife, a tall woman with sun-browned skin, brought out a tin pitcher of water and set it down for them without a word. Otto stared at her as though she were a saint descending from heaven. "She doesn't look afraid of us," he whispered. "She doesn't need to be," Franz said. Otto drank greedily, water running down his chin. "Do you think they hate us?" Franz didn't answer right away. The woman's presence lingered, her quiet dignity unsettling him more than any curse or spit might have. "No," he said finally. "I think they pity us." After the break, they were marched past the town on the way back to camp. Franz noticed details he had missed the first day: the painted signs on the store windows, boasting of sugar and coffee for sale, the bright posters urging citizens to buy war bonds, the chatter of people on the street as though the war were no more than a distant story told in a newspaper. At the corner, a group of teenagers loitered near the diner, laughing and passing a bottle of cola between them. They glanced at the column of Germans with open curiosity but no fear. One of the girls waved playfully at Otto, who went crimson from ear to ear. Harold barked, "Eyes front, Meissner," but the corner of his mouth twitched in amusement. That night, in the barracks, the men could not stop talking about what they had seen. Some were angry, others awed. One of the older sergeants muttered that it was all a trick to break their spirit. Franz sat apart, writing by the weak light of the bulb dangling overhead. "Mother," he wrote, "America is a land that feels too wide for war. Their shelves are full, their children laugh, their farms are fat with grain. I cannot tell if it is mercy that they feed us well, or cruelty, because each day I eat, I know our people go hungry. Perhaps this is the real weapon, to show us what we are losing." When he put down the pencil, Otto climbed up to sit on the edge of his bunk. "You're quiet, Franz. What are you thinking?" "That this is a country that cannot be starved," Franz said. "No blockade will stop it. No bombers will frighten it. They have too much." Otto frowned. "You sound almost admiring." Franz closed his journal. "Perhaps I am. Or perhaps I am just a man who sees the truth." The next day brought more work, more proof that this land was a giant that never slept. They were put on a different farm, where machines replaced most of the hand labor. The tractor was a hulking beast, its engine coughing and growling as it rolled over the soil. Otto stared at it with wide eyes. "That thing is bigger than the truck they brought us here in." "Bigger than two of them," Harold said with a grin, standing with his thumbs hooked in his belt. "Got a dozen more just like it out here. We keep the good ones for the harvest." Franz watched as the machine plowed through the earth, leaving perfect furrows behind. There was no stopping this country. Its fields would keep feeding its soldiers, its factories would keep building its tanks and planes. Every turn of that tractor's wheels felt like the ticking of a clock counting down the Reich's days. That night, as the men lay in their bunks, a radio played somewhere near the guard post. The tune was American swing, bright and defiant, and it carried through the quiet camp like a dare. Some of the prisoners turned away, muttering that it was decadent music, unworthy of a soldier's ear. Otto, however, smiled faintly. "It sounds happy," he said. Franz stared up at the ceiling. "Yes," he said. "It does." Outside, a freight train rattled by in the dark, heading east with a full load of wheat. The sound was deep and steady, like the heartbeat of the country itself. Franz closed his eyes and listened, the rumble echoing through the barracks until it seemed to fill his chest. He could not escape the thought that each sack of grain, each turn of the wheel, was one more reason they would never win. When morning came, he rose before the others and stepped outside, the cool air damp against his face. Beyond the fence, the fields glowed pale in the dawn light. It was beautiful, and for a moment he felt an ache in his chest, not of homesickness, but of something harder to name. Otto appeared beside him, yawning. "Another day of work," he said. "Yes," Franz replied softly. "And another day of learning." The bugle sounded then, sharp against the sky, and the men began to stir. The camp came alive once more, ready to march them back into the land that seemed to grow stronger by the hour. Franz squared his shoulders and followed the line, each step carrying him deeper into the uneasy knowledge that this war was already slipping away from them, grain by grain, harvest by harvest. The first autumn storm came without warning. One evening, the wind began to rise, scattering pecan shells across the campyard and rattling the loose tin on the mess hall roof. By morning, a hard rain was drumming the barracks, turning the Texas dust into a slick, red clay that sucked at boots. The fields were too wet to work, so the prisoners were kept inside. For the first time since they had arrived, they had nothing to do but sit, smoke, and think. Franz Keller sat at a wooden table near the window, the journal open before him. His pencil hovered above the page, but no words came. He could hear the other men talking quietly, playing cards, complaining of boredom. Even Otto Meissner, who normally filled every silence with chatter, seemed restless, drumming his fingers against the tabletop. "Do you think they'll let us read?" Otto asked suddenly, nodding toward the small camp library the guards had unlocked for the first time that morning. "Read what?" Franz asked. "Anything," Otto said with a shrug. "A newspaper. A book. I'd even take a comic strip at this point." Franz considered. "If they do, it will be propaganda." Otto grinned. "So what? At least it's something." An hour later, Sergeant Harold Whitaker entered, stamping the mud from his boots. "All right, boys," he called. "You've been begging for something to do, now's your chance. Command says you can take books or papers if you want. Just remember, you tear anything up, you lose the privilege." The men rose eagerly, crowding toward the shelves. The selection was meager but strange. Farming manuals, American novels, a stack of Life magazines, and, to everyone's surprise, actual newspapers from nearby towns. Franz took one cautiously, as if it might explode in his hands. The headlines spoke of strikes in Detroit, rationing measures, even political arguments about the war effort. This was no tidy, triumphant version of America. This was America talking to itself. "They print this for everyone to see?" Otto said in disbelief, leaning over Franz's shoulder. "So it appears. They let people criticize the government? In the middle of a war?" Franz folded the paper, troubled. "Either they are very confident," he said, "or very foolish." Later that afternoon, Lieutenant James Wilcox himself appeared to address the camp. He stood in the doorway of the mess hall, his cap pulled low against the rain. "Gentlemen," he said, "we will be showing a film tonight. Attendance is optional, but recommended. It is educational material prepared for prisoners of war." A murmur rippled through the room. Some scoffed openly. Surely it would be American lies about the Reich. But when the projector began to whir that night, the images on the sheet strung up at the far end of the hall were not crude caricatures but grim footage of battlefields. Smoking ruins, dead soldiers, refugees trudging along roads with their belongings strapped to their backs. It was not triumphal but matter-of-fact, as if the Americans were saying, "Here is what war does, and you may draw your own conclusions." Franz watched silently, arms crossed, while Otto's face worked with emotion. When the film ended, there was no lecture, only the guards turning up the lights and telling the men to return to their bunks. In the weeks that followed, the camp changed. The library was used more often, the newspapers passed from hand to hand until the pages grew soft with handling. Debates broke out in the evenings, some heated, some philosophical. Franz found himself drawn into these arguments despite himself. One night, a corporal from Bremen insisted that Germany would still win, that secret weapons would turn the tide. "And when they do," the man said, his eyes gleaming, "we will march into Moscow and London both." Franz's voice was calm but cutting. "And then what? Will these farmers starve? Will these trains stop running? Look around you. Even here, in the middle of nowhere, they have more food than we have at the front. Their machines do not sleep. Do you not feel it? This country does not fear us." The barracks fell quiet at that. Even Otto had no joke ready. That Sunday, Harold escorted a work detail into town to help repair a fence line washed out by the storm. As they passed the church, Franz heard singing, clear, strong voices carrying through the open windows. The hymn was simple, but there was something in its tone that caught at him. These people sang as though they believed the future belonged to them. On the way back, Harold surprised the men by stopping at the general store. "You boys wait here," he said, and disappeared inside. When he came out, he tossed each man a stick of chewing gum. Otto turned the bright wrapper over in his hands like it was treasure. "This is what they give children," he said. "Then consider yourself a child again," Harold said dryly. Otto popped the gum into his mouth and nearly choked trying to chew it. The others laughed, even Franz, though the sound startled him. It had been a long time since laughter came so easily. Back at the camp, Franz began to read American books, first cautiously, then with growing hunger. Steinbeck, Twain, Hemingway. Their language was spare but powerful, full of dust and sweat and hunger and hope. He read by the dim barracks light until his eyes burned, until the words seemed to whisper that there was more to the world than flags and orders. One evening, he found Harold sitting outside the gate, rolling a cigarette. The sergeant looked up. "You ought to be asleep." "I wanted air," Franz said. He hesitated, then asked, "Do you believe what you are fighting for?" Harold struck a match, the flare lighting his weathered face. "I believe my boys shouldn't have to learn German unless they want to. I believe folks ought to vote for who they want, drink what they want, pray how they want, so long as they don't bother their neighbor. And I believe the only way to make sure of that is to see this war through to the end." Franz nodded slowly. The man was no philosopher, but there was a strength in him that reminded Franz of the farmers back home, the ones who kept working no matter which government claimed power. The next morning, word came from Europe. News of a bombing raid on Hamburg so devastating that even the Americans seemed grim as they passed out the papers. Franz read the casualty numbers and felt a hollow opening in his chest. That night, there was no arguing in the barracks, only silence. Weeks passed. The rhythm of the camp became almost comfortable. The men grew stronger, their cheeks filling out, their skin darkening under the Texas sun. They no longer looked like an army in defeat, but like laborers who had work worth doing. One afternoon, while stacking sacks of grain, Otto turned to Franz with a sheepish grin. "You know what I was thinking? When this war is over, I might come back here. Buy a farm. Grow peaches." Franz stared at him. "You would live here?" "Why not? The land is good. The people, they don't hate us." Otto hesitated. "It feels like a place a man could start over." Franz did not answer, but he could not shake the thought. That night, he wrote in his journal, "If this country is our enemy, it is a strange one, an enemy that feeds us, teaches us, even laughs with us. Perhaps they know something we do not. Perhaps they are showing us the future." The next day, a Red Cross officer arrived to interview prisoners. Franz spoke politely, but when asked about his treatment, he said only, "We are well fed." He did not mention the books, the films, the songs from the church. He was not sure he wanted Berlin to know how much this place had already changed him. That evening, a new shipment of newspapers arrived, their pages announcing the Allied landings in Italy. The camp buzzed with speculation, but Franz sat quietly, staring at the headline. The war was moving, turning, accelerating, and he was behind wire, watching history roll past like a train he could not board. When the lights went out, Franz lay awake, the sound of the guards' footsteps steady outside. The camp felt less like a prison now and more like a school, one that taught through bread and sunlight and work. He realized that the lessons he had learned here would not be easily forgotten. In the morning, the bugle called them out again. The sky was wide and blue, the fields still damp from the last rain. As Franz picked up his hoe, he glanced toward the horizon where the sun was rising, and for a moment he felt a strange, reluctant gratitude. Whatever else this war had taken from him, it had given him this, a glimpse of a world that might be worth living in when the fighting was done. And deep in his chest, a thought settled with quiet certainty. The Reich could still fight, could still kill, could still burn, but against this country, with its endless fields and open sky, with its laughter and its libraries and its quiet, stubborn faith, they had already lost. Summer in Texas had a way of being cruel without seeming to notice. The sky was so wide and blue it almost mocked the men who sat under it, sweat streaking their necks, shirts clinging to their backs. Karl Hoffman sat on the wooden bench outside the camp barracks, elbows on his knees, staring at the distant cotton fields. He had seen Russia in winter, France in rain, but nothing felt quite as foreign as this. Sun on your face while your country bled on the other side of the ocean. It wasn't just the heat that gnawed at him. It was the sound. Laughter from the American guards, the creak of wagons, the country music humming from a radio someone had left on. It sounded like a nation untouched, almost smug in its ease. Oberfeldwebel Ernst Weber stood beside him, arms folded, his shadow falling over Karl's boots. "They don't know there's a war," Ernst said flatly, as if naming the joke they were all living through. Karl smirked, though it didn't last. "They know. They just don't feel it. Not like we do." Inside the mess hall, a crate of Red Cross newspapers sat open, their headlines weeks old by the time they reached Texas. The prisoners pounced on them anyway, reading aloud between mouthfuls of cornbread. Stalingrad had been a wound that never stopped bleeding. Kursk was now a fresh one. Even the most loyal voices among them had begun to falter, sentences trailing off mid-sentence as if words had betrayed them. That night, the air was heavy and still, smelling faintly of dust and cut grass. The men gathered in small knots near the barracks, swapping rumors under the dim yellow bulbs strung from pole to pole. One man claimed Hamburg had been flattened by bombers. Another swore the Allies had landed in Sicily and were marching north. Karl listened, silent, until he caught the voice of Sergeant Miller, the American guard, talking just loud enough for them to hear. "They got factories back home running 24 hours, Miller was saying to a fellow guard. "Hell, my brother's making trucks faster than these guys ever drove them. You think they're gonna catch up? Not a chance." It wasn't a taunt. It was casual, almost bored, and somehow that made it worse. Karl felt something cold settle in his chest. It was one thing to lose to an enemy you imagined as ruthless, superior, iron-willed. It was another to lose to someone who didn't even seem to notice you were fighting. The next morning brought trucks, big, dust-caked Chevrolets, to take them out to harvest. Karl sat in the flatbed, wind in his hair, staring at the horizon. Ernst sat across from him, his jaw set. The work was hard, but not cruel. They were given water, decent food, even cigarettes if the guard felt generous. And still, every kindness felt like a reminder that the war, for them, was already over. The turning point came with a letter. Lieutenant Vogel had been the most defiant of them all, still saluting every morning, still speaking of the Führer as if his voice might carry across the Atlantic. That day, a single envelope arrived with his name scrawled in his wife's neat hand. He read it once, twice, then let it fall to the dirt. His face was ashen. "What is it?" Karl asked, though he already knew. Vogel's eyes stayed on the ground. "They bombed Kassel. My parents' house, gone. My brother, gone." His voice cracked, and then, for the first time, he cursed. Not the Americans, not the enemy, but the very war itself. No one spoke for a long time. The cicadas buzzed, the air shimmered, and somewhere a tractor backfired like a rifle shot. It was Ernst who finally said it aloud. "Then it's finished," he muttered. "For us. For all of it." That night, the camp was unusually quiet. Even the Americans seemed to sense the shift, their usual jokes muted. Karl lay awake on his cot, staring at the rafters. In his mind, he saw his father's farm back in Bavaria, saw the cattle in the pasture, the smell of hay at dusk. He wondered if it still stood or if it, too, was ash by now. When dawn broke, the air was cool, a brief mercy before the sun rose. Karl walked out past the fences until the guard called him back. He just needed to see the land spread before him one more time. The cotton fields glowed pale in the early light, endless and quiet, as if nothing in the world could touch them. It struck him, suddenly and with awful clarity, that this was what victory looked like. Not flags, not speeches, just this stubborn, unbroken abundance. Later, in the mess hall, the men sat hunched over their coffee, not speaking. Even Vogel, usually first to bark orders, stared into his cup. When Miller walked by, he paused, sensing something unspoken. "You boys look like you been to a funeral," he said lightly. Karl looked up at him, a thin, tired smile on his lips. "We have," he said. It was not defeat on a battlefield that had undone them. It was this slow, inexorable dawning that the war had already been decided by machines they'd never seen, by shipyards that turned out Liberty ships faster than they could sink them, by fields like these that would never run empty. That evening, as the sun set in a blaze of orange and red, Karl stood with Ernst by the fence line. "When we go home," Ernst said quietly, "if we go home, it won't be the same." Karl nodded. "No," he said. "But maybe that's the point." The lights in the camp flickered on, one by one, casting long shadows on the ground. For a moment, Karl let himself imagine the war ending not with the thunder of guns but with this: just men, standing in silence, watching the night fall over a country that had already moved on. And for the first time since his capture, he felt not rage, not bitterness, but something that almost felt like peace. The war was lost, yes. But maybe, just maybe, that meant something else could begin.